Hey there everybody, Sage Apapam here again, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and welcome back here to another episode of The Plant Path. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the science and spirituality of herbal medicine, and specifically how I see them as not necessarily having to be these opposing, contradictory ways of thinking and approaching and thinking about things. And I'm really passionate about this subject because, for me, this was like my original kind of obstacle I faced on my plant path of, having my spiritual kind of foundation being in my connection to nature and to plants and to the forests and to the wisdom that's present there. And on the other side of things, my background in training in herbal sciences and understanding their chemistry and their pharmacological mechanisms of action, and how that really kind of divided me in a way where I felt like these two parts of myself were kind of playing tug of war, the science part in my head, in my brain, and in my way of thinking, and the spiritual side of things more in my heart and in my kind of the feelings and the intuitive side of things and just in my connection with the natural world. And it was really the alchemical tradition for me that brought these two together and showed how science and spirituality don't necessarily have to be at war with one another. And this is something that I've really noticed a lot over the years, where sometimes you get people that are very strongly oriented in the science side of things and really needing kind of rational explanations for everything. And they get turned off by anything woo-woo or anything that can't be, explained by science. And on the other end of the spectrum, you get people that are really into the woo-woo side and into the spiritual side of things that can kind of really put down the scientific side and say, it's overly intellectual, or it's too heady and it's too reductionistic. And I just think that they don't really need to be opposing. And in fact, I don't see them as being opposing at all. I really see them as being two sides of the same leaf. They're two different ways of looking at the same thing. We have the physical side of things on the science, and we have the invisible side of things on the spiritual side. And to me, if we want to have a holistic view, if we want to have a holistic take on things, I believe that having both is important and useful and helpful and gives us a better, well-rounded understanding and approach to working with people and plants. So the way I think of thinking of the concept of the spirit or the soul, which, in alchemy, those are actually two kind of distinct parts of the self. But simply put, we're really talking about, in terms of people, just the core of who you are, your essence. The fact that we, obviously we're not just bodies, right? And obviously we're not just our thoughts, because we can exist. There's something still there. The I, the me, the self is still present there, even if you're not thinking, even if you're not feeling anything, right? So the spirit or the soul is just that part of the self that is beyond the mind, beyond the emotions, and it is what is our consciousness, right? It's the consciousness itself. And within plants, they have that same thing, right? That the plants aren't just, a slew of biochemically active constituents, even though those are really important. There's still something greater to a plant than that, right? That these plants have an intelligence, they have an awareness, they are aware. And science has proven this, science has shown very clearly that plants are aware of their surroundings, that plants have the same sensory mechanisms that we do, albeit, different organs for doing so, but plants still see. They just don't have eyes like us, but they're aware of light. They smell, they're sensitive to aromatic compounds, right? They have a sense of touch. They can tell when they're touching a physical object in space, etc., right? So plants have consciousness, plants are intelligent. And to me, that is a spiritual thing, right? That alone completely changes how we approach a medicinal plant, right? Because now when we go to, say, harvest a plant, we're not just going to go out there and just rip these plants out or just strip all these leaves off or cut the tree down. It's like we're going to have a little bit more of an awareness to the fact that this is a conscious, sentient, aware being, and maybe we'll approach those plants with a little bit more respect and reverence and gratitude and kind of approach them in an honorable way. So to me is when we're thinking about, the spiritual side of herbal medicine, to me, it's recognizing that there is a spirit within a human that is beyond the physical health, the emotional and mental health, and there is a spirit within the plant as well. And then when we look at spiritual practice of herbal medicine, it's recognizing that these plants have the ability to heal us in that deeper way, right? That there is a spirit of the plant that can heal the spirit of the person, and that it has the ability to heal us just beyond, fixing our physical symptoms or, helping cure a certain disease, or, right? That there's a deeper level of healing that can happen when a medicinal plant interfaces with a person that touches a very deep level of the self, that transforms us, that they have the ability to help us move beyond the patterns that bind us and limit us in our lives, that they have the capacity to help us to overcome the traumas that we've faced in our life and to heal those parts of the self, to heal on the level of the soul. And that ultimately is a central part of the evolutionary herbalism model, because that's what the plants have done for me. And that's what the plants have done for a lot of people out there in the world and in the evolutionary herbalism community. And that's what a lot of herbal traditions from all around the world say, right? That these plants aren't just working on a physical level. I think one thing about the scientific paradigm, though, is that they oftentimes need everything to be able to be explainable by science, that everything needs to have a rational explanation. And I think that in kind of my way of seeing things is that maybe there's certain things in this life that can't necessarily be explained by science, that there's always something, a mystery at play. There's something inexplicable. There's something beyond what can be scientifically proven or broken down into some mechanism of action, that there's always something that can't be figured out or physically explained. And that to me is where I think the strictly scientific oriented folks can maybe expand a little bit, right? To open up and recognize that there is kind of something greater happening here in terms of what is going on with plants and people. And the same is true again with the people that, the scientific side, like because of science, we understand plants on like a totally deeper level than ever before, right? I mean, what science has discovered about medicinal plants, it blows your mind. Like to me, the level of complexity that science has shown is present within a medicinal plant, and then what happens when a human ingests that medicinal plant, it's like we can't figure it all out, right? I mean, there's like hundreds and hundreds of chemical constituents in a plant, and the level of synergy and reaction and interaction that happens once those chemicals get into our body is so infinitely complicated. I don't think science can ever really map the whole thing out, even for a single plant. And that to me is almost like a proof of the miracle, the spirit that's happening there, the vast intelligence that it's beyond what we can actually kind of decipher or determine or figure out. But nonetheless, I do believe that science has a great role to play in the development of herbal medicine, the refinement of our knowledge of how plants are healing us, and still has a lot to offer. I think the important factor here is being able to honor and acknowledge both sides, to honor and acknowledge the invisible miracle the spirit of life and things, and to also honor and acknowledge the physical reality of what's going on with the plants. And I think this has, a reflection in how we approach healing, that disease, like why we get sick, can happen for a wide variety of reasons. And on the science side of things, it's like, well, it's because of a molecular imbalance or a biochemical imbalance within the body that needs to be corrected by chemical means. The spiritual side, oftentimes people see it as like, oh, there's a sickness on the spiritual level that then is trickling down and affecting the physical and everything in between, right? The mental, the emotional, etc. From my perspective, it's a two-way street, right? That happens both ways. So we can see that disease can start on a spiritual or a soul level. Think about serious trauma, right? When someone experiences a very traumatic event, it affects them spiritually, right? It affects their consciousness. It affects their perception. It affects their dream and their sleep. It affects their thought processes. They can have a flashback thinking of like war veterans. I have family members that were war veterans that would have really severe flashbacks. To me, that's a spiritual thing. That's something that deeply affects the soul through that trauma, and it affects the thinking, it affects the emotions, and ultimately can affect us physiologically as well. But the reverse is also true, right? That we can have, a really great example of this is something like food intolerance, right? Well, when someone is intolerant to a certain food, say gluten or dairy, they eat that food, it can cause a systemic inflammatory response in the body. But one of the first symptoms that people get actually when they say do a 6 to 8 week elimination of an intolerant food and then they reintroduce it, one of the first symptoms is irritability, right? They get pissed off, they get frustrated, or they get anxious. They start feeling stressed and nervous and anxious, or maybe they get really depressed. We typically define those as like more of a psychological, emotional type symptom. Of course, there's physiological basis for it, but it's in the mind. Like the main problem there is in the mind, but the root of it is in the body. And so it works both ways, right? The physical affects the emotional, mental, and spiritual, and the spiritual trickles down and affects the mental, emotional, and physical. And you know why? Because they're not separate. And this is one of the things about the alchemical tradition that I absolutely love, is that it says, yes, we have these kind of layers of our being. We have a physical side, what they call salt. We have a mental, emotional side, what they call mercury. And we have a soul that they call sulfur. But we are one. We are one being. These kind of patterns of layers of organization are just ways of breaking it down to kind of understand ourselves, but they're not separate. There's not a hard line between them, which is what we see in nature. Look at a rainbow. Is there a line between each color of the rainbow? No, they all blend together. Think of notes on a musical scale. Do you go from, B to C? No, there's a whole spectrum of notes in between. Everything's a spectrum. And we're the same way. So I really like to think of the importance of that in the evolutionary herbalism model, we really strive to look at a person and their healing process holistically and see where is the cause of the problem. Like, is it on the physical side? Well, here's tools and strategies to address it physically. If it's not, maybe it's spiritual, mental, emotional. Well, there's other ways of looking at that, assessing that, and creating treatment plans to support people on that level too. So as herbalists, I think we don't have to be limited to just treating physical issues, and we also don't have to be limited to just treating spiritual issues. And I see that divide a lot in the herbal world, right? Where there's just the people that just treat the body, and then there's like plant spirit people or flower essence people that just work mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. And I'm like, no, they're all one. We have to have a system, a model, an approach that brings them together. And that is really what we strive to do here at at the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. And, one of the other things that I think is important is like, okay, we're talking about the science and the spirit in people, the science and the spirit in healing. There's the science and the spirit in the plants too, which we're talking about, that they have a chemical makeup, right? That these plants have a biochemical intelligence, right? But that biochemical intelligence oftentimes is developed through that plant's awareness of its environment. It's been pretty clearly shown that plants grown in the wild, plants growing in their natural environment out in the wild, no human hand has touched it or given it compost or watered it on a dry day. Those wild plants get stressed out, right? They've got, natural pests, and they've got weather and temperature fluctuations, and they've got lots of competition of other plants in the area. Those plants make stronger medicine because the plant is aware of its environment and it develops these biochemical mechanisms to defend and to protect itself and to communicate with its environment. So the way I see it is that the biochemical makeup of a plant is actually guided and directed by that plant's spirit, by its conscious awareness. And that is a really profound thing from my perspective. And conversely, cultivated plants tend to not be quite as potent. They tend to not be quite as strong. And I think that's because they're kind of babied along, right? We make sure they're weeded and we give them nutrients and compost and they're dry, let's give them some water, right? And I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that it is actually like stressors that tend to produce broader spectrum, more concentrated biochemical potency within plants. And I guess my point here is that to me is kind of guided by that awareness within the herb. And so yes, there is chemical interactions happening to heal and help our physical body, but there's also consciousness in that plant that's interfacing with our own consciousness, right? I mean, this is how sometimes people start working with plants and, things come up, like emotions come up and thoughts come up and memories from the past come up and dream life changes. This is all especially true when you're working with alchemically prepared medicines, because alchemically prepared medicines are concentrating the spiritual properties of the herb alongside the biochemical properties of the herb. And that's the last area I really wanted to talk about here in terms of uniting the science and spirituality of herbalism, is in our pharmacy and how we prepare and craft medicine. This is another split I see. And me, like, maybe I'm conflict avoidant, Like, I don't really like taking sides because I tend to be pretty mutable and have the ability to really see things through other people's perspectives. And I'm a pretty open-minded guy. And to me, I see, people on the science side, I'm like, oh yeah, I can totally see that. And I see people on this side, I'm like, oh yeah, I can totally see that. And we see that in the way people use medicine too sometimes, where, there's like, these are the physically active medicines, like standardized extracts or tinctures or infusions, decoctions, salves, infused oils, like all those medicine preparations that are, the primary ones herbalists use that are there to heal the body, right? And that's great. And then you have on the other side of the spectrum, you have those forms of medicine that are more, subtle in nature or vibrational in nature, such as things like flower essences, right? Or even homeopathics, which, from the scientific perspective, there's like nothing there. We're talking molecules in parts per million, parts per billion, depending on how the potency of the remedy. But it has been demonstrated that even things in that small amount can still have an impact on the body. But that's another discussion. But the point is that it's like, okay, these medicines work on the body and these medicines work more mentally, emotionally, spiritually. To me, a holistic approach to herbal medicine, again, it bridges those gaps, those kind of, to me, illusory gaps. And that's where Spagyric Herbal Pharmacy is so powerful, because this is a method of crafting herbal medicine that directly honors the science and the spirit within the plant, that it says, yes, there is biochemical constituents present that we want to optimally extract, preserve, and concentrate. And at the same time, there is an esoteric component of the plant as well that we want to extract, concentrate, and preserve. And so the whole art of spagyric herbal medicine, spagyric pharmacy, is doing specific extraction techniques and even timing of when you harvest and when you prepare and when you do certain alchemical works with a plant in order to preserve, separate, purify, and put back together what is called the sulfur, the mercury, and the salt of the plant, or the soul, the spirit, and the body. Or I like to think of it as, the chemical, the energetic, and the spiritual properties of the plant in one extract. So when you take that spagyric remedy, it is healing the wholeness of the person. I always like to say, if we want to be holistic herbalists, we don't want to just understand the whole plant or the whole person, but we want to use a holistic medicine too. We want to use a medicine that concentrates the whole plant so it'll heal the whole person. And so this is why alchemical philosophy and practice and spagyric pharmacy is a real central part to my approach to herbal medicine. It's really the primary form of herbal medicine that I use, and it's just like blow your mind how powerful and effective they are in terms of bringing about this deeper level of transformational healing that really does work beyond the body. So the EH approach, right? Here at the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, when we approach studying herbal medicine, when we're approaching, learning about people, right? When we're approaching learning about plants, we want to really strive to keep that balanced approach and talking about relevant scientific information, its chemistry, its mechanisms of action, how to optimally extract and preserve the constituent profile in that plant, along with any relevant esoteric or spiritual properties that plant has based on, tradition, based on experience, based on, tradition and experience primarily, i.e. not just stuff someone made up, right? But things that are actually been shown that this plant actually has this effect. Not saying that we can't receive information from the plants about their properties, but oftentimes I see, sometimes folks will, maybe sit with the plant and, maybe get something about that plant that seems like it's a spiritual property or a way that plant works on the psyche or the emotions. And then it's just maybe distributed through a content channel or written about in a book as though it's hard fact, but maybe they haven't actually used the herb in that way clinically to actually see if it actually does do that thing that they received from the plant, right? And so I think I'm not trying to put that down, but I'm saying I think there's an approach and a way to really validate and make sure and clarify and confirm that a plant does indeed have a particular spiritual property or esoteric virtue associated with it. And the same is true with people, right? That when we're studying people, we want to really look at the anatomy and the physiology and the biochemistry, and also understanding, disease processes and pathology, and relating that to, traditional herbal wisdom about, energetics, like how, maybe a modern disease relates to the doshas of Ayurveda, or to, TCM pattern, organ system patterns, or, from my approach too, to relevant medical astrology patterns, to psychological emotional dynamics, right? To see again the relationship between the whole person. And I'm going to talk in a future little post here in this series, and I'm introducing some of the core concepts of evolutionary herbalism. I'm going to be going into a little bit more of what I see being very important to look at in the whole plant and the whole person. But to me, again, this integration between science and spirituality is really what I see as the new paradigm of herbal medicine, right? That I believe that we can further develop and progress herbal medicine in a way that really honors tradition, honors modern science, as well as honors a lot of the spirituality that naturally develops around medicinal plants and just earth-based spirituality, nature-based ways of worship, ways of really honoring something greater than the self. And I think that's one way that we can work with medicinal plants moving forward too, is really providing that level of support for people out there. Because to me, like, a lot of the problems that we face in the world these days, I see as kind of like a spiritual sickness that is rooted in our separation from nature. And these medicine plants have the ability to kind of reconnect people to that intelligence of the earth, and to kind of reawakening their own natural being, their natural mind, their natural self, their true self, and through that, supporting in our own evolutionary development as a soul. So just wanted to share a little bit about science and spirituality of herbal medicine, and kind of the bridging of the esoteric and the clinical. So thanks so much for joining me here in this post. Hey, if you enjoyed what you heard here, or got comments or questions, feel free to share this with a fellow plant-minded friend of yours or family member. And thanks so much again for being a part of the Evolutionary Herbalism community. If you're watching or listening to this anywhere but the blog, be sure to head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com, where all the stuff is happening over there, and hit that like and subscribe button. It really does help support the channel, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or on listening to the podcast. We really appreciate the support in that way. It helps us continue to be able to put out quality free content for you all and the herbal community. So once again, I'm Sage Popham. Thanks so much for joining me here. And until the next one, take care and be well.